They called it a piece of junk. A rusty relic that belonged in a museum, not on a shooting range. A 78-year-old man with a cane in one hand and a battered Winchester model, 1897 in the other, walked up to the firing line at a charity clay shoot, and every single competitor behind the safety rope started laughing. One of them, a guy in a $500 Beretta shooting vest with more patches than a NASCAR driver, pointed at the old man's shotgun and said loud enough for the entire crowd to hear, "Somebody tell Grandpa the war's been over for 80 years. The laughter doubled. The old man said nothing. He stepped into the box, shouldered that beat-up trench gun, called pull, and for the next 6 minutes he didn't miss a single clay. Not one. 25 for 25. Perfect score. And by the time the last orange disc exploded into dust against a bright blue sky, nobody was laughing anymore. If you believe that respect is earned through actions and not appearances, comment the word honor right now before we continue. The charity shoot was called the Patriots' Pull, and it had been held every October for the past 11 years on the sprawling grounds of the Ridgewater Sporting Club just outside of Lexington, Kentucky. The event raised money for wounded veterans and Gold Star families, and it attracted shooters from across the tri-state area. Some came for the cause, most came for the competition, and a few came because it was the kind of event where you could show off a $12,000 over-under Perazzi and have people actually notice. The morning of the 11th annual Patriots Pool broke cold and sharp, with frost still clinging to the grass at 7 in the morning, and a sky so blue it looked painted. By 8 o'clock, the parking lot was full of pickup trucks and SUVs, tailgates down, gun cases open, men in expensive vests and polarized shooting glasses, milling around the registration tent drinking coffee from styrofoam cups and talking about choke tubes and shot patterns. The teams were organized into squads of 5, rotating through 5 stations of 5 targets each for a total of 25 clays per shooter. Standard rules, standard format. Nothing unusual about any of it, except for the man who walked up to the registration table at exactly 8:15 carrying a shotgun that looked like it had been pulled from a trench in France. His name was Earl Jessup, and he was 78 years old. He walked with a slight limp and used a wooden cane that had been worn smooth at the handle from years of use. He was thin but not frail, with a wiry kind of toughness that suggested a life spent working with his hands rather than sitting behind a desk. His face was deeply lined, weathered by sun and time, and his hair was white and cropped close to his skull in a style that hadn't changed in 50 years. He wore a faded red flannel shirt, a pair of khaki trousers that had been washed so many times they were almost white, and a pair of brown work boots that were cracked at the toes. He didn't look like a competitive shooter. He looked like someone's grandfather who had wandered away from a yard sale, and slung over his shoulder on a leather strap that was cracked and darkened with age was a Winchester Model 1897 pump-action shotgun that looked every bit as old and worn as the man carrying it. The bluing on the barrel was almost entirely gone, replaced by a patina of rust and use that gave the metal a rough, mottled appearance. The walnut stock was scarred and dented, with a long crack running along the wrist that had been repaired at some point with what appeared to be wood glue and a prayer. The action was stiff and the pump handle rattled slightly when the gun moved. The barrel had a bayonet lug on the end of it, which meant this wasn't just any Model 1897. This was a trench gun. The same model that American soldiers had carried into the Argonne Forest in 1918 and onto the beaches of the Pacific in 1944. A combat weapon, designed for close-quarters fighting, with a shorter barrel and a heat shield that had long since been removed from this particular specimen. It was, by any modern standard, an antique, and it had no business being on a sporting clays course in the 21st century. Earl walked up to the registration table, set his cane against the edge, and told the young woman behind the folding table that he'd like to sign up. She looked at him, looked at the gun, and to her credit, simply asked for his name and his $20 entry fee. Earl paid in cash, exact change, folded bills from a leather wallet that was as worn as everything else he owned. She handed him a scorecard and a pair of foam earplugs still in their plastic wrapper, and told him he was assigned to Squad 7, Station 1, starting at 9 o'clock. Earl nodded, tucked the scorecard into his shirt pocket, and walked slowly toward the waiting area near the first station. That was when the trouble started. Not trouble in the violent sense. Trouble in the way that cruelty often begins, with a smirk and a whispered comment that's meant to be overheard. The other 4 members of Squad 7 were already there, and they had been watching Earl's approach with the kind of expressions that fell somewhere between amusement and disbelief. The first was a man named Trent Calloway, 43 years old, an orthodontist from Louisville who shot competitively at least twice a month and owned more shotguns than most people owned shoes. He was wearing a custom Beretta shooting vest with his name embroidered on the chest, polarized Oakley shooting glasses, and a hat from a Sporting Clays Invitational in San Antonio that he'd finished fourth in the previous year. Trent was the one who had made the crack about the war being over, and he wasn't done. The second was Kyle Reddick, 36, a real estate developer who had taken up shooting 2 years ago and had thrown money at the hobby the way he threw money at everything, which meant he had the best equipment and middling talent. The third was Dale Furman, 51, a quiet insurance adjuster who was a decent shot but preferred to stay out of confrontations. And the fourth was Brett Howell, 29, a former college baseball player who had the hand-eye coordination to be genuinely good at this, but lacked the discipline to practice consistently. Trent looked at Earl's Winchester the way a sommelier might look at a box of wine. He tilted his head, crossed his arms over his embroidered vest and said, "Sir, I don't mean any disrespect, but are you sure that thing is safe to fire?" Earl looked at him with steady grey eyes that didn't blink. "It fires," Earl said. His voice was quiet, not weak, but controlled. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who had learned a long time ago that volume was not the same thing as authority. "I can see that it fires," Trent said, smiling at Kyle, who was already grinning. "What I'm asking is whether it fires in the right direction," Kyle laughed. Brett tried not to. Dale looked at his shoes. Earl said nothing. He simply leaned on his cane and looked out at the first station, where a clay thrower was being loaded by a volunteer in an orange vest. Trent kept going, the way people do when they mistake silence for weakness. "Look, this is a charity event, so obviously everyone's welcome, but we're trying to compete here. That thing doesn't even have a ventilated rib. How are you going to track a clay with a bead sight on a combat barrel?" Earl looked at Trent for a long moment. Then he said, very simply, "The same way I've always done it." And then he turned back toward the first station and didn't say another word. The first station was a standard crossing target, left to right, thrown at moderate speed from a tower about 40 yards out. It was the kind of target that warmed you up. Not too fast, not too tricky, just a clean orange disc arcing across the sky waiting to be turned into dust. Trent shot first. He mounted his Beretta 694 Sporting, a gun that retailed for just under $4,000, called Pull, tracked the clay smoothly and broke it cleanly at about 30 yards. A good shot. He lowered his gun with the practiced ease of someone who expected to hit what he aimed at and stepped back. Kyle went next with his Browning Citori, broke the clay on his second shot after missing the first, and shrugged it off with a laugh. Brett hit his on the first pull with a quick athletic swing. Dale hit his cleanly too, quiet and efficient. And then it was Earl's turn. He stepped into the box slowly, planting his cane against the wooden frame of the shooting station. He reached down, picked up a single shell from the small canvas bag he carried on his belt, and loaded it into the Winchester's tubular magazine. The action was loud in the silence. That heavy, distinctive chunk of a pump shotgun being racked, a sound that hadn't changed in over 100 years. He shouldered the gun. And this is where the first crack appeared in the wall of assumptions that everyone had built around Earl Jessup, because the way he shouldered that shotgun was not the way an old man picks up a hobby. It was the way a piece of steel becomes an extension of bone and muscle, a single fluid motion that started at his feet and ended at his cheek, and when the stock settled into the pocket of his shoulder, it fit there like it had been carved for him. His left hand wrapped around the pump handle with a grip that was firm without being rigid. His right hand found the trigger guard like it was coming home. His posture shifted. The limp disappeared. The cane was forgotten. He wasn't leaning on anything anymore. He was standing the way a man stands when he knows exactly who he is and exactly what he's about to do. "Pull," Earl said. The clay launched, and Earl Jessup did something that made every single person watching take a half step back. He broke the clay at 20 yards. Not 30, not 35, 20. The orange disc had barely cleared the top of its arc when the Winchester barked once. A sharp, authoritative crack that echoed across the field, and the clay simply ceased to exist. It didn't chip. It didn't crack. It vaporized into a cloud of orange dust that hung in the air for a moment before the breeze carried it away. And the thing that made it extraordinary wasn't just the speed of the